welcome to the third in this series of webinars hosted by Deloitte that looks into the future of customs. My name is Jamie, and in a moment I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Sam. But before I do, there will be an opportunity at the end of Sam's presentation to answer as many questions as you like. So while Sam is presenting, please do submit them. If we don't get to your question, don't worry, we will get back to you after the presentation. So without further ado, let me now pass you over to Sam.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. My name's Sam Farley. I'm an Associate Director in our Global Trade team today, and I'm going to walk through some of the new trade regulations that have been introduced this year, but also look back on the new trading regulations that were also introduced on the 1st of January 2021. So if we can flick to the second slide, please. I believe this looks at the contents of what we're going to talk through. So we're going to talk through the current situation, what changes took place, what changes will take place on the 1st of July 2022, and then also quickly discuss the new customs declaration software that Deloitte is bringing to the market for small to medium enterprises. So if we move to the next slide, the current situation, obviously the biggest change that took place was on the 1st of January 2021. And it was the largest trade change to the customs landscape that the UK and the EU has felt in decades. And that was obviously when the UK left the European Union. Now, alongside the original split from the EU, the UK published what's known as the Border Operating Model Guidance Paper on the 13th of July 2020. So that was around 5 months before the end of the transition period. And it effectively explained to traders how HMRC was going to make a phased approach to the implementation of border controls. And this has been split into 3 specific phases, which I will walk through in the following slides. But just to summarise phase 1, which has already taken place, phase 1 was introduced on the 1st of January 2021, apologies. It was probably the largest change in terms of regulation. It was the first day that obviously customs controls were implemented on movements of goods between the UK and the European Union. So for imports into the UK and exports from the EU, there was the requirement to obviously submit customs declarations, and all goods were subject to customs control. However, within the border operating model, it was all around the implementation of those full controls at different times. And therefore, during phase 1, there were some specific easements that HMRC had introduced. One of those easements is the ability to delay making a customs declaration. So HMRC allowed traders up to 175 days to actually physically submit the customs declaration after the goods physically crossed the border. The second interesting easement was that products that are subject to control, specifically in the area of plant and animal origin. So traditionally, all products of plant and animal origin that have been imported into the United Kingdom from outside of the European Union have been subject to veterinary and further customs controls. And when we were in the EU, this was a pre-notification to the Traces portal, and also an export health certificate was required to be submitted. Now, on movements from the European Union into the UK of product of plant and animal origin, HMRC said that for the first 12 months of the transition period, there would be no controls on these particular products unless they were subject to further license requirements. So, for example, any types of endangered species or any, let's say, plant or animal product that may have disease controls as well in place. But any kind of standard movements of chicken, etc., there was no controls in place for the first 12 months. There was also an easement introduced around rules of origin. So obviously very topical with Brexit, we do have a free trade agreement in place. However, to benefit from free trade, it's absolutely paramount that traders are able to evidence that the particular products when crossing borders meet the product specific rules of origin. And if they do meet the rules of origin, then it is possible to import those goods without any tariffs attached to them and therefore pay no customs duty. Now, there are 2 ways of claiming preferential tariffs upon import into the UK. The importer can use its own knowledge that the goods originate, and it must retain that knowledge in some form. Therefore, there must be some form of audit trail that those goods make the product-specific rules of origin. So, for example, if the importer has absolute knowledge around how those products are manufactured and can evidence that the products meet those product-specific rules when manufactured in the European Union, then it can use importer's knowledge. If the importer itself doesn't have that knowledge, for example, it isn't related to the party that's manufactured or doesn't carry out the manufacturing itself, and instead is buying from a completely unrelated party, then what it can rely on is a statement on origin, which is made on the commercial invoice by the exporter. So the exporter in the European Union, when it makes its commercial invoice, would add a line at the bottom that states effectively, to the best of its knowledge, these products meet the rules of origin. And as an importer in the UK, if you receive a commercial invoice that has this statement at the base, you can therefore submit your customs declaration and state that these goods are preferential and customs duty isn't required to be added on that particular movement. Now, the easement in this space was that usually behind those commercial statements, an importer would be required to obtain a further proof of origin, which is the statement of origin from the exporter or the supplier itself. Now, the easement from HMRC said that at the time of submitting your customs declaration in the UK, you wouldn't require the statement on origin at that moment in time, because they recognise that shipments, specifically in the early part of the year, January through to March, it may take some time for importers to obtain that documentation from their suppliers. However, obviously, what HMRC did say, this isn't a free hit by any means. There will be audits in the future that don't only look at 2022 onwards, they will also look at 2021. So for any goods that were imported subject to preference under either of those mechanisms and under that easement, it was an expectation that the trader, after the date of import, would still request the documentation from the suppliers so that if audited in the future, they would be able to substantiate that. And then the other final one that we can't not mention is obviously the controls relating to Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland and everything that went on around Northern Ireland not wanting a physical border was obviously one of the key deadlocks of the Brexit negotiation. And the Northern Ireland Protocol was also implemented on the 1st of January 2021. And what the Northern Ireland Protocol requires is that there are customs declarations submitted on import into Northern Ireland when goods leave Great Britain. So there's no requirement to submit an export declaration in Great Britain when moving goods into Northern Ireland, because the UK government has always said it wants trade between GB and Northern Ireland to be as seamless as possible. However, to implement, or basically to get Brexit over the line and implement, I suppose from the EU's perspective, retain the integrity of its external border, the EU demanded that there is a formal notification when goods are imported into Northern Ireland, and therefore customs declarations are due on introduction into Northern Ireland. So that's a brief walkthrough of the changes that took place in phase one, which was from the 1st of January 2021. So if we move to the next slide, now we're looking at what phase two looks like of the border operating model. So the key things in phase two, I guess, the main one in many senses is the removal of the delayed declarations facility. And now all traders are required to submit full declarations on import into the UK at the time the goods are imported into the United Kingdom. So that can be done by making a customs declaration either in the chief system, which is going to be decommissioned later this year, but it has been the system that's been in place for since I think it was 1985. And within chief, to make a customs declaration, there are 54 data elements. Now, what we will be transitioning to from chief into CDS, which is the new system, in CDS there are over 70 customs data elements, and the CDS system mirrors that of all of the European Union customs systems as well. So hopefully the data that's in the export declaration from the customs systems in the European Union should in the future, once we move to CDS, map over quite clearly. However, what is key to acknowledge is that UK importers will go from 54 elements to over 70. So there is extra data that will be captured when the move over to CDS is complete. Now, a lot of businesses do, well, some do complete customs declarations in-house, but there are many businesses that will outsource this requirement to third parties and third parties in the process. And what we've seen across the market from this change away from delayed declarations is that there's a number of traders that didn't realise that where they're working with third parties, that those third parties maybe hadn't upskilled with technology, maybe hadn't brought on enough internal resource to actually submit those declarations. Those third parties had taken it upon themselves to use the delayed declarations facility to make their internal processes better. And now from the 1st of January, where the requirement is to submit them at the time, they, one, can't keep up to current speed, but also there's a huge backlog, 6 months worth of submitting declarations. And we've seen some third parties turn around to traders and actually say, we're going to really struggle to submit these within the 6-month window. And then the traders, therefore, obviously really concerned around compliance requirements, because ultimately, if you use the delayed declarations facility, it's on the importer themselves. So businesses are now thinking about, actually, can we move away from the delayed declarations? Do we have to rely on that third party for the backlog that exists? Can we clear those goods ourselves, given that we should have that information within our own system? The second large change is that, as I mentioned before, there was no control around imports of plant and animal origin for the first 12 months. There now is. So there is the absolute requirement to notify the Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs, so DEFRA, up to 24 hours prior to the goods being imported into the United Kingdom. And that notification happens in a system called IPAFS, which is the import of product of animal food and feed system. So a trader is required to make that pre-notification in the IPAFS system 24 hours before those goods board the vessel effectively in the territory of export. Now, obviously that is an added issue. There's an added consideration for traders. And what we did see, specifically in the first couple of weeks of January, was numerous turnbacks at the port. So speaking to somebody who, I've got a colleague that works in government for UK Border Force, and they mentioned that there was 30% turnback of trailers that on ro-ro ports that imported product of animal and plant origin. And one of the main reasons that they thought there was such a high percentage of turnbacks is that HMRC and other industry groups in the UK had done a really good canvassing to traders themselves to inform them of these changes, but actually the education that took place in the European Union wasn't as profound, and therefore the exporters maybe weren't as well educated on these changes and weren't aware that these changes were going to take place, and were therefore continuing to operate the processes that were in place in 2021, which has hence resulted in traders actually turning up at the territory of export, so Calais, for example, not making this pre-notification and having their consignment stopped at the border. Next slide, please. So the other changes that have taken place in phase 2 is the pre-lodgement model. So this is the pre-lodgement of the customs declaration itself. So as we mentioned before, there was no requirement to submit a full declaration at the border, and therefore pre-lodgement wouldn't work because some companies would make the declaration, some may take up to 6 months. Now what HMRC requires is that all traders have submitted their customs import declaration prior to actually arriving at the border of arrival. So it's really important, again, that traders have controls here, whether you submit your declarations in-house, whether your freight forwarder submits those declarations for you. It's absolutely paramount that whoever that party is aware of when your consignment is actually going to physically reach the port, because it's important to know, again, those goods get to the port, there's a chance that they can be turned back. The goods can also be housed at the port for a short period of time. However, in that case, there's normally significant demurrage charges, where there will be hourly charges passed on to you as an importer. And in some cases, there may also be penalties as well if it causes significant delays, traffic issues, then the, let's say, French customs authorities, Dutch customs authorities can also impose penalties on traders that are causing these particular issues. So that pre-lodgement point is really, really important. Next slide, please. It's really important, again, RoRo locations. So one of the main reasons that the border operating model focused on that delayed declarations was for two reasons. One, there was a concern that traders weren't actually ready to comply with the regulations that the change in the customs landscape was going to put upon them. So there was almost a bit of an additional breathing space for traders to get those controls and relationships in place. The other important point is that there was a number of roll-on, roll-off locations that maybe didn't have the infrastructure available to also deal with the traffic, the trade, the inspections that were going to take place. So obviously those controls are now in place, but those controls maybe were more designed anyway in terms of the easements for RoRo, so roll-on, roll-off ports. And it's important to know that the removal of the delayed declarations and the implementation of these full controls are not only at deep water ports, so the more established traditional ports such as Felixstowe, they're also at your roll-on, roll-off locations like Dover as well. There's been the introduction of the goods vehicle movement system. So what GVMS is there is a requirement for a trader to obtain a GMR. So that's a goods movement reference for each shipment and report that. And what that informs is the direction of the crossing A, whether it's an import or an export, the registration number of the vehicle that's making that crossing, and also the trailer number attached to the vehicle and therefore the customs declaration. Now, in some cases, you may be sending one trailer which just has your goods in it, and therefore there's one GMR, there is one declaration to each GMR, where the actual haulier is moving a groupage consignment. So for example, if you're moving maybe one crate or one pallet of goods, and it's actually grouped with a number of traders, that haulier is required to get one GMR, but will need every single declaration reference from all of the traders to obtain that GMR. And what we've actually seen here is hauliers are charging where the haulier itself isn't involved in the making of the customs declaration process. So for example, a third party like FedEx, DHL, Kuehne+Nagel, Deloitte for even, is making that customs declaration, but the haulier is responsible for the GMR. The haulier will be actually charging a handover process, which is up to, we've seen in some cases, a £30 fee for taking that declaration number and entering it into the GVMS system to get that GMR. So obviously something to be aware of there. And some traders were doing that and trying to catch traders out, but there is no way realistically that you as a trader should be forced to pay that. So if that does take place, then please be aware that that is not usually a requirement, certainly not a legal requirement. And there may be space to obviously have a bit of a negotiation on that particular point. And then the final point goes back to POAO. So when there is an export of the product of animal origin, an import of product of animal origin, then an export health certificate needs to be lodged and in place. So this is for exports from the UK to the European Union, I should say. So from the 1st of January, when you make the declaration in traces, there's always been the requirement to do a pre-notification on export from the UK into the EU for products of plant and animal origin in a portal, what's known as the Traces portal. From the 1st of January this year, a UK export health certificate also needs to be presented alongside that pre-notification. So that summarises the changes that have taken place in phase 2. So now the next slide, we'll look at the changes that are going to take place in phase 3. So phase 3, the key changes are from the 1st of July, that's similar to what we've just mentioned on export to the European Union around SBS checks and the requirement for EU export health certificates. For imports into the United Kingdom from the 1st of July, exports from the EU into the UK, that pre-notification, the iPass portal, will now also need to be adjoined by that export health certificate. So it will go from a pre-notification to a standard full notification, which will be the notification in iPass with an adjoining EU export health certificate, which is effectively a veterinary certificate signed off that the product of plant or animal origin is fit for consumption or purpose on entry into the UK. And also from the 1st of July 2021, all products of plant and animal origin will need to move through designated border control posts. Now, what a border control post is a specified area at a port that is equipped to undertake checks on plant and animal product, and there will be designated vets at those particular sites. So there's been one that's been built at a business park near Dover. The one near Southampton is due to finish later this month, and that will all go live from the 1st of July. And it's also important to note that from the 1st of July, safety and security declarations will also be required for imports at RoRo locations into the United Kingdom. Now, what the safety and security declaration does is informs HMRC about all of the information around the actual transport vessel, which is consigning the goods into the UK. And the idea is to basically reduce the risk of terrorism and the reduce of trafficking, people, or prohibited items such as weaponry and drugs, etc. So it's the responsibility of the carrier to submit this safety and security declaration. However, we have seen carriers chance their arm and actually tried to charge traders for the submission of the safety and security declaration. But the absolute legal requirement to do this is with the carrier. So again, if anybody has tried to charge you to make those safety security declarations in the future, remember the legal requirement to submit those sits with the carrier themselves. And without the carrier performing that declaration, it actually wouldn't be able to move goods into the United Kingdom. So it's a really, really important point there. Probably the last point I'm going to make on 1st of July 2022 and also 2020, the start of 2022 in January as well, is we've started to see a real increase in the number of customs audits, and that's some of those points around delayed declarations and the requirement to have now the documentation around customs origin. There's an absolute requirement to make sure that we've got all of that in place. All traders are aware of these requirements, and those audits are happening and happening at an increased rate. So if we move on to the next slide, I think we just want to briefly mention our new customs clearance software. So Deloitte, for a number of years, has operated a customs clearance business. However, traditionally, we've worked with large traders, and we have a managed service operation that completes full declarations using simplified procedures. But what we recognised was that whilst obviously Brexit has caused real concern for large businesses, it's also raised concern for smaller traders who maybe don't have the volumes and maybe don't ship the values that actually warrant using a managed service, which has a price point of maybe £50 per declaration, for example, and actually wants a declaration that's a more price efficient end of the market, but also is a mechanism that allows a trader to complete the declaration themselves using the information that they have to hand and using a piece of software that breaks down what is a very technical process into something that is more understandable and bite-sized. And what we've introduced is Deloitte Customs Clear, which is an application that allows you, a trader, to log on to themselves onto their own account, submit the information relating to your particular shipment, control everything that goes through that mechanism, import all of that data, and submit that data to HMRC yourselves. So we've tried to streamline the process, which only asks the questions for your type of goods. Where there are no controls will not be asked for. Where we are using a specific mode of transport, let's say roll on, roll off hauliers, we will not be asking questions around airway bills, etc. So really tried to streamline that process. We're undertaking demonstrations of this software. We also have an introductory offer for traders who are interested in this software. And obviously after this webinar, please feel free to get in touch for more information around this particular offering. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just I guess that's the final slide. As Jamie mentioned, we will have some time for questions now. We acknowledge that this is a very confusing time for businesses, and please feel free to ask your questions. As we mentioned, if your question doesn't get answered, then of course we can follow up after the call, after the webinar. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really, really interesting. And I think what you've done is give a lot of context to some of the challenges that traders have faced since the start of this year. And also, at the same time, shining a spotlight on the changes that are coming up in the summer as well. So thank you very much. I think we've got a couple of minutes left. So let's try and take 2 questions if we can. This one's come in. The first question is, does every business need to make a customs declaration?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. So I think the first place that you need to start with that is considering the specific supply chain and understanding the Incoterm that you're trading on. So Incoterms are a set of terms that will define the responsibility on a cross-border movement of goods, and they will effectively inform you whether it is your responsibility to be an exporter or be an importer of record. And where that is the case, then obviously you will need to make that import or export declaration. There's also a really important point about the requirement to make a customs declaration, and specifically if you're going to import goods into the United Kingdom, then what you need to be aware of is that HMRC introduced a policy around 18 months ago that stated that if you're going to make an import declaration and you want to recover the import VAT that you obviously pay at import, then you need to be the legal owner of those goods. So if you're importing goods, you're not the owner, then there's obviously a consideration you need to have there about whether you need to change your contractual terms or whether you should say to the owner, the party who is the owner, you need to be the importer. But obviously to recover the import VAT, it's important that you're the owner. And where that is the case, it's important that you do make the customs declaration and you're the importer yourself. So to answer the question, look at the supply chain, look at the contractual terms, and then make that decision.
Great stuff. And then just a second, I know we've just come up to 12:30, but perhaps 30 seconds. This is a really important one, actually. All the talk in the media for the last month has been about delays at the border. What's actually going on? Is it supply chain, customs checks, or both?
I think it is a mixture. I think it was always going to be difficult, specifically at the less traditional customs ports. So moving away from the deep water ports like Felixstowe and focusing on ports like Dover, where there was obviously the introduction of controls last year, but not to the same level that they are now, with full decks required, with plant and animal checks required. That there was always going to be extra delays and more confusion around the process. As we mentioned before, turnbacks in the European Union. What has exaggerated this, obviously, is what we've all had to live with now for over almost 2 years, I guess, is the pandemic. And certainly the Omicron variant, its timing hasn't helped, because there, as we have all read in the news, has been severe staff shortages, both in the NHS, both across all sorts of industry, and that doesn't change here. Border Force officers have been away from work, obviously sheltering from COVID, and that's resulted in shortages at the port and therefore almost less presence at the port to deal with these changes, and therefore it's been an absolute perfect storm. I mentioned the turnbacks at the start of the month for around 30%, where that education piece maybe hasn't been done in the European Union. That certainly has fallen, and we're now down to maybe between 10 and 5%. So there has been real improvement there, but I think overall it's just a mixture of the new controls that have come in, but also the environment with COVID as well.
Fantastic. Thanks to you, Sam, and thank you very much for spending your lunchtime with us. If you asked a question we didn't get to, don't worry, we will get back to you. But please do get in touch if you would like to know more. And enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.